My husband publicly humiliated me and said he only married me out of kindness. I should have realized something was off the moment we stepped into the restaurant. It was overflowing with people, loud and frantic, packed with fans celebrating a hometown sports win. The air felt thick with noise and alcohol, and even before we reached our table, I could sense the tension rolling off Mark. His jaw was tight, that familiar rigid set that always meant irritation, and he kept glancing down at his phone as if waiting for something or someone. I remember thinking it wasn't the right place for us, not with the chaos and shouting, but I stayed quiet. Over the past year, I'd learned that questioning his plans only led to accusations that I was controlling or impossible to please, so I smiled and followed him through the crowd. His college friends, Jason and Brian, were already seated near the back, waving us over with drinks half gone and faces flushed from the noise. They greeted us warmly, standing to hug Mark and shake my hand, complimenting my outfit and joking about how long it had been since we'd all been together. Their enthusiasm made me feel briefly at ease, like this night might turn out fine after all. The restaurant walls were plastered with sports memorabilia, screens flashing replays from every angle, and our server shouted the specials over the roar of the crowd. We ordered appetizers and drinks, and for a while, things felt almost normal. Jason and Brian launched into stories from their college years, ridiculous pranks and near disasters that had us laughing despite the mayhem around us. They talked about sneaking into the campus pool after midnight, about a road trip that fell apart in every possible way, and I found myself relaxing, chiming in with comments and laughing along. Mark even seemed to loosen up after his first drink, then another, his shoulders dropping as if he'd finally settled into the evening. I stuck with soda since I was driving, not knowing yet how important that decision would become. Then Jason leaned forward with a curious grin and asked how Mark and I had met. It felt like a harmless question, an easy story to tell, and I opened my mouth, already shaping the familiar answer about a mutual friend's party and a long conversation that had stretched late into the night. Before I could say a word, Mark cut me off. His voice had an edge that made my stomach tighten, a sharpness I recognized from arguments behind closed doors. He laughed and said it was simple, that I'd basically begged him to date me. At first, I forced a small laugh, assuming he was setting up a joke, maybe exaggerating for effect. But when I looked at his face, I knew he meant every word. He grew louder, making sure everyone at the table heard him over the noise. He said I'd been desperate, that I'd thrown myself at him because no one else would want me. He gestured toward me like I was a product under harsh lighting, rating my looks with cruel precision, saying I was average at best and lucky anyone had bothered. The table went silent in a way that felt unreal, the surrounding cheers from nearby tables clashing painfully with the stillness at ours. My face burned, then went numb, and I gripped my glass so hard I thought it might crack. Jason and Brian shifted uncomfortably, laughing nervously, eyes darting anywhere but at me. No one told him to stop. No one defended me. Mark took another drink and kept going, saying the only reason he'd stayed married was because finding someone better sounded like too much effort. Dating apps, small talk, pretending to care. He said it was all a hassle, and staying with me was easier. Our appetizers arrived in the middle of his monologue, the server oblivious as he placed the plates down, and Mark didn't pause even then. I kept waiting for someone to intervene, for a subject change or a joke to break the tension. But his friends stared at their plates like they held the secrets of the universe. Then Mark started inventing stories, accusing me of being clingy and invasive, claiming I snooped through his phone whenever I could. None of it was true, but he said it with such confidence that I saw doubt flicker across their faces. When Brian tried to redirect the conversation, Mark raised his hand and shut him down. He said he wasn't finished, that everyone needed to hear this. When he looked at me, I saw something colder than anger in his eyes, something stripped of any affection or respect. He said he'd married me out of pity, that he'd done me a favor, and I should be grateful. That was when my body moved before my mind could catch up. I stood so fast, my chair scraped loudly against the floor. I lifted my full glass of soda over his head, the ice rattling, and for a few suspended seconds, no one moved. Mark stared up at me, stunned, mouth open mid-sentence. Then I tipped the glass and poured it out. The soda soaked his hair and shirt, ice bouncing off his shoulders as it dripped down his face. Someone nearby laughed, and the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. I grabbed my purse and walked away without saying a word. I didn't run. I forced myself to walk steadily through the crowd, past the hostess who stared wide-eyed, out into the night air. The cold hit my face and I started shaking so badly I couldn't find my keys. People passed by, glancing at me as I fumbled through my bag, tears spilling despite my efforts to stop them. When I finally got into the car, I just sat there gripping the steering wheel, trying to breathe as my phone lit up with Mark's name again and again. I declined every call, silenced the phone, and drove home in stunned quiet. That night, I left every light on in the apartment. I sat on the couch, staring at the walls, at our wedding photo, at the life I thought we shared. When Mark showed up hours later, drunk and furious, buzzing the intercom and shouting for me to let him in, I stayed still. His messages grew uglier as the night wore on, blaming me for embarrassing him, threatening consequences. I blocked his number sometime after 2 in the morning and slept fitfully, haunted by dreams of sitting frozen while he tore me apart again. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay there. I packed a bag and drove straight to my parents' house just after dawn. My mother opened the door in her robe and took one look at my face before pulling me inside. She didn't ask questions right away, just made coffee and wrapped me in blankets. When my father came in and asked what happened, I told them everything, every word Mark had said, every moment of that night. My father listened in silence, jaw clenched, then stood and said he had something to take care of before leaving the house. My mother squeezed my hand and told me I wasn't going back. Not yet, not until we figured things out. For the first time since the restaurant, I let myself cry without holding back. sitting at my childhood table while she stayed beside me. When my father returned hours later, he placed a business card in front of me for a family law attorney named Richard and said simply that help was waiting when I was ready. I stayed at my parents' house that entire morning, barely touching the food my mother kept setting in front of me. I scrolled through my phone in a numb haze, watching messages stack up without opening most of them. Around noon, a notification finally broke through the fog. It was from Brian's wife, the one who had gone quiet at the table. She asked if I was okay, and then warned me that Mark had started calling people, claiming I'd been drunk and attacked him out of nowhere. My hand shook as I typed back that I hadn't touched alcohol all night, that I'd been the only sober one there. After that, I made a subtle post online about being the designated driver in certain situations. Nothing dramatic, just enough to anchor the truth. Almost immediately, private messages started coming in, people asking what really happened, some cautiously, others with obvious concern. Before I could respond to many of them, my father walked back into the kitchen and started cooking as if nothing unusual had happened. His quiet way of restoring normalcy. That illusion shattered minutes later when my mother stiffened and whispered that Mark was at the door. He came in looking wrecked, still wearing the stained clothes from the night before, eyes wild and unfocused. He pointed at me and shouted that I'd humiliated him and demanded I apologize in front of my parents. My mother told him to lower his voice. He ignored her and stepped toward me, and my father moved instantly, positioning himself between us. His voice was calm but edged with warning when he told Mark to back away. Mark tried to shove past him, and everything escalated in seconds. My father pushed him hard enough to make him stumble, and when Mark lunged again, my mother screamed for him to leave the house. After a brief chaotic struggle filled with shouting and fear, Mark finally retreated, slamming the door behind him. My mother collapsed into tears, and I ran upstairs, locking myself into a bedroom, while my phone exploded with rumors and questions. Sitting on the bed where I'd slept as a teenager, I made a decision I'd been circling since the restaurant. I opened my phone and started writing. I didn't rant or exaggerate. I laid out exactly what had happened at dinner, quoting Mark's words as accurately as I could remember, describing his behavior afterward and his confrontation at my parents' house. I attached screenshots of his messages, demanding apologies and threatening consequences, along with timestamps showing I'd been sober while he drank. I read everything twice, then sent it to our shared contacts, close friends, extended family, and yes, even his mother. The responses came fast. Some people were shocked, others apologized for not knowing what to say. A few admitted they'd always felt something was off but hadn't been able to explain why. Jason messaged me privately, confessing he hadn't grasped how serious things were until he saw Mark's behavior firsthand. He admitted Mark had complained about me before, painting me as controlling and insecure, and that he'd believed it until that night. He offered to testify if needed, as did Brian's wife, both acknowledging they should have stepped in sooner. I blocked Mark everywhere and turned my phone off for several hours just to breathe. A few days later, I went back to the apartment to collect my essentials, borrowing my father's car so I wouldn't be alone. The place felt hollow the moment I stepped inside. The television and game console were gone, yanked out of the living room, and their absence made the space feel strangely lighter. There was a passive-aggressive note on the counter accusing me of betrayal. Dirty clothes were scattered everywhere, a careless mess that felt symbolic. I started packing methodically, separating my things from his, gathering documents and sentimental items I couldn't bear to lose. While sorting papers in his office, I noticed the locked drawer that had been off limits throughout our marriage. This time, the key was sitting right there. I hesitated only a moment before turning it. Inside were stacks of unopened envelopes, stamped with warnings and collection notices. One by one, I opened them, my stomach dropping further with each page. Tens of thousands in debt, credit cards I'd never known about, threats of asset seizure. I sank into his chair, barely able to breathe as the total came together in my mind. $64,000, hidden over 2 years while he told me everything was fine. As I kept digging, I found credit card statements showing recurring charges to a premium dating site, starting 8 months before that dinner, monthly fees, extra purchases, money spent courting other women while we were still married. My hands trembled as I opened his laptop and logged into his email, discovering dozens of conversations filled with promises and plans. Lies about separating soon, photos from trips he'd claimed were for work. It all snapped into focus at once. His irritability, his secrecy about money, the way he'd shut down any talk of the future. The humiliation at the restaurant wasn't accidental or fueled by alcohol. It was deliberate, a push meant to force me to end things so he wouldn't have to. I photographed everything, organizing the evidence carefully before locking the drawer again. The anger that had burned since that night cooled into something sharper and clearer. I flipped our wedding photo face down on the shelf and packed the last of my bags. As I was leaving, Mark showed up, blocking the doorway and accusing me of stealing from him. He reeked of alcohol even then. I told him calmly to move. After several tense minutes, I forced my way past him and left, calling Richard from the car with a shaking voice and asking for help. Within a week, I'd rented a small apartment across town and started rebuilding. The legal process was slow and exhausting, full of paperwork and delays, but Richard guided me through it patiently. Mark tried to stall and manipulate, offering unfair settlements and making absurd claims about stolen property. None of it worked. By the time we reached the final hearing, I was drained but steady, dressed simply and ready to tell the truth. When the judge reviewed the evidence of hidden debts and infidelity, his expression hardened. Mark admitted I hadn't known about any of it. The ruling was clear. Mark was solely responsible for the debts, and he was ordered to compensate me for misusing our shared funds. As I walked out of the courtroom past him, his face red with shame and fury, I felt nothing at all. Not triumph, not hatred, just a deep, overwhelming relief. In the days after the hearing, life didn't suddenly become lighter or easier, but it did become quieter. The constant buzz of anxiety that had lived under my skin for months began to fade into something manageable. The divorce wasn't officially finalized yet, and there were still documents to sign and waiting periods to endure. But the worst uncertainty was over. The judge's ruling had made it clear where responsibility lay, and that clarity alone felt like oxygen. I moved fully into my new apartment, a modest place with creaky floors and 2 little closet space. But it was mine in a way nothing had been mine before. The first week there felt strange and empty. At night, the silence was loud, and I caught myself listening for sounds that would never come. No keys in the door, no footsteps in the hall, no voice from the other room. I slept with a lamp on at first, more out of habit than fear, and woke up disoriented, reaching for a phone that wasn't there. But slowly, the space began to soften. I unpacked boxes one by one, arranging my books exactly how I liked them, leaving dishes in the sink if I wanted to, choosing music without worrying if it annoyed someone else. Richard checked in regularly, updating me on filings and deadlines. The bureaucracy dragged on, full of minor setbacks that felt enormous when I was already exhausted. Papers had to be refiled because of formatting errors. Court clerks went on vacation. Dates were pushed back. Each delay felt like another thread tying me to a life I was desperate to move beyond. Mark's lawyer sent letters suggesting mediation, proposing compromises that would have left me responsible for some of his debts. Richard advised me not to engage. Everything would be handled through official channels. Documented and final. Mark tried one last tactic, claiming I'd taken personal items that belonged to him. It was ridiculous. A transparent attempt to regain control or at least slow things down. We sat through a brief administrative review where his claims fell apart under even minimal scrutiny. When it ended with nothing resolved in his favor, I felt another small weight lift from my chest. Each failed attempt on his part confirmed what I was learning to accept. He no longer had power over me. During that time, my parents stayed close without hovering. Sunday dinners became routine again, comforting in their normalcy. We talked about movies, work, the neighbor's dog, anything but Mark unless there was a practical update to share. I could see my mother watching me carefully, noting the days when I smiled more easily, the moments when I laughed without forcing it. My father didn't ask questions. His presence was steady and unspoken, and I learned to take comfort in that. When the divorce was finally finalized, months after that night at the restaurant, I expected fireworks or some grand emotional release. Instead, it was anticlimactic. A signed document, a confirmation email, a brief call from Richard telling me it was done. I sat on my couch staring at the wall for a long time afterward, waiting to feel something dramatic. What I felt instead was tired, deeply and completely tired, but also free in a quiet, undeniable way. The compensation payment came several weeks later. Not enough to erase all the damage, but enough to stabilize me. I paid down what little shared debt remained, built a small emergency fund, and let myself buy things I'd always justified away before. A comfortable chair for the living room that swallowed you whole when you sat in it. Curtains in a deep blue shade Mark would have hated. Plants, more than I knew how to care for at first, lining every window. Keeping them alive became a small, grounding ritual. Proof that I could nurture something and watch it grow. At work, something shifted too. Without the constant drain of managing Mark's moods and crises, I had energy I didn't recognize at first. I volunteered for projects I would have once avoided, spoke up in meetings without rehearsing every sentence in my head. My manager noticed. She pulled me aside one afternoon and told me she was impressed by my initiative and confidence. A few months later, I was offered a promotion that came with more responsibility and a salary bump that made me feel secure for the first time in years. Started seeing a therapist not long after the separation, at Richard's suggestion and my mother's quiet insistence. The first session was brutal. I cried more than I talked, struggling to articulate how someone could dismantle you slowly while insisting they loved you. She listened without rushing me, without minimizing anything, and by the end of that hour, I felt a fragile sense that healing might be possible. She recommended a support group, and though I dreaded the idea, I went. The group met in a community center on Tuesday evenings, a circle of folding chairs and strangers carrying stories heavy enough to fill the room. At first, I barely spoke, content to listen and nod, but hearing others describe experiences so eerily similar to mine chipped away at the isolation I hadn't realized I was carrying. One woman in particular, a few years older than me, shared a story of hidden debts and emotional manipulation that mirrored my own. We started getting coffee after meetings, and a genuine friendship grew from that shared understanding. Mark faded into the background of my life with surprising speed. I blocked him everywhere and resisted the urge to check up on him through mutual acquaintances. When someone mentioned him in passing, I felt detached, like they were talking about a character from a book I'd finished long ago. His mother called once, weeks after the ruling, her voice sharp at first, accusing me of ruining her son's life. I listened calmly and explained the facts she clearly hadn't been told. The line went quiet, and when she spoke again, her tone had changed. She apologized awkwardly before hanging up. She never called again. As months passed, I began to recognize myself again. Not the version shaped by constant criticism, but the person I'd been before. I filled my weekends with things that felt good rather than productive. Long walks, books I'd been meaning to read, cooking meals just because I wanted to. I hung my diplomas on the wall, framed and unapologetic, reclaiming achievements Mark had once dismissed as irrelevant. Each small decision made without consulting anyone else reinforced a growing sense of autonomy. There were setbacks, of course. Some mornings I woke up heavy with doubt, wondering if I'd overreacted, if I could have tried harder. On those days, I pulled out the photos of the debt notices and the messages to other women. Reminders that the truth didn't change just because time softened its edges. Gradually, those days became less frequent. The good days began to outnumber the bad. One evening, sitting in that too expensive chair with a mug of tea, I realized something that startled me. I hadn't thought about Mark in days. Not in anger, not in sadness, not at all. The realization felt like a door quietly closing. I wasn't just legally divorced anymore. I was emotionally untethered, finally and fully, and the space that opened up inside me felt expansive and full of possibility. Healing didn't move in a straight line after that realization. It came in uneven waves that surprised me with their timing and intensity. Some days I woke up energized and certain I had made the only choice that could have saved me. Other days, a random smell or passing comment would pull me backward, and I'd find myself questioning everything again. On those days, I reminded myself that doubt didn't mean regret. It meant I was human. I leaned heavily on the routines I had built, the simple anchors of morning coffee, evening walks, and weekly therapy sessions that helped keep me grounded. The support group became an unexpected constant. What started as an obligation slowly transformed into something I genuinely looked forward to. Listening to others speak their truths made mine easier to carry, and when I finally shared my own story in full, there was no shock or disbelief in the room, only understanding. That acceptance healed something I hadn't known was broken. The friend I'd made there became part of my regular life. Someone I could laugh with about small things and process big ones without having to explain every detail. My parents gradually relaxed too. The constant check-ins faded as they saw I was standing on my own again. Sunday dinners became lighter, filled with teasing and shared memories instead of concern. I noticed my mother watching me less closely, my father texting fewer reassurance messages. It felt like being trusted again, like they believed I was capable of steering my own life forward. That trust mattered more than I realized. One of the most unexpectedly emotional moments came when I legally changed my name back. The paperwork itself was straightforward, but when the confirmation arrived, I sat alone on my couch and cried harder than I had in months. It felt like reclaiming a part of myself that had been quietly taken. My name no longer carried the weight of a marriage that had drained me. It belonged to me again, unencumbered. With time, I began to date cautiously and without expectations. I wasn't looking to replace anything, just curious about who I was now. One man spent an entire evening complaining about his ex, calling her unstable and dramatic, and I knew before dessert arrived that there would be no second date. Instead of questioning my judgment, I felt proud of how quickly I recognized the red flags. It was a small but powerful victory. About a year after everything unraveled, I found myself back at the same restaurant, sitting at a table with my support group friend. The noise was familiar, the decor unchanged, but the power it once held over me was gone. It was just a place, not a wound. We ate, talked, and laughed, and when I excused myself to use the restroom, I realized my hands weren't shaking. The memory no longer controlled me. I never saw Mark again after the courthouse. Sometimes I imagined running into him at a grocery store or on a crowded street, rehearsing calm, indifferent responses in my head, but it never happened. The city was large enough to keep our lives separate, and eventually, I stopped imagining those encounters altogether. He became a closed chapter, not one I revisited often. My therapist asked me, months later, what I felt I had learned from the experience. At first, the question annoyed me. It felt unfair to extract lessons from pain, but as I sat with it, an answer formed. I had learned that survival doesn't always look brave in the moment. Sometimes it looks like pouring a soda, walking away, and refusing to explain yourself. I had learned that anger can protect you, but only temporarily, and that peace requires letting it go when its job is done. Most of all, I learned that being alone is infinitely better than sharing space with someone who makes you feel small. That realization reshaped how I moved through the world. I trusted my instincts more. I paid attention to discomfort instead of dismissing it. When something felt wrong, I listened. 2 years after that night, my life looks nothing like it did before, and that feels like a gift. I have a job that challenges me, friends who show up without being asked, and a home that reflects who I am rather than who I was trying to be. I'm seeing someone now, casually and without pressure. Someone kind who never makes me feel like I should be grateful for basic decency. Sometimes I think about the woman I was at that table, holding her glass and trying to understand how love could turn so cruel so quickly. I wish I could reach back and tell her that this moment, as devastating as it feels, is also the beginning of her freedom, that the pain won't last forever, and the strength she doesn't know she has is about to reveal itself. If I could speak to her, I'd tell her to trust herself, to walk out without looking back, and to know that a fuller, lighter life is waiting just beyond that door. The strange thing about rebuilding a life is that you don't notice the progress while it's happening. There isn't a single moment where everything suddenly feels fixed. Instead, it sneaks up on you in quiet, almost unremarkable ways. One day you realize you're humming while doing dishes. Another day you notice your shoulders aren't permanently tense anymore. Weeks pass without that familiar knot of dread in your stomach, and you don't even register its absence until you try to remember the last time you felt it. Healing, I learned, is subtle like that. My apartment slowly transformed into more than just a place I slept. It became a reflection of me in ways I hadn't allowed before. The deep blue wall in the living room made the space feel grounded and calm, especially in the evenings when the light softened. The plants grew, some thriving, some not, and I learned through trial and error which ones needed more sun or less water. Taking care of them became meditative, a small daily responsibility that connected me to the present moment. I liked that they responded to consistency and patience, something my marriage never had. The expensive chair remained my favorite spot, not because it was a symbol of indulgence, but because it represented choice. Every time I sat in it with a book or a cup of tea, I was reminded that I no longer needed permission to take up space or enjoy comfort. I could decide what mattered to me without negotiating or justifying it. That realization quietly rewired something deep inside me. Work continued to be a source of confidence. The promotion settled into something steady rather than surreal. and I found myself mentoring newer colleagues, encouraging them to speak up the way I once struggled to. There was something deeply satisfying about being trusted, about having my voice carry weight in a room. It wasn't about proving Mark wrong anymore. It was about proving myself right. My friendships shifted too. Some people drifted away naturally, unable or unwilling to reconcile the truth with the version of events they'd been told. I let them go without the resentment I might have felt before. The friendships that remained felt stronger, built on honesty and mutual respect. I stopped over-explaining myself. The people who mattered didn't need constant clarification. Dating stayed casual and intentional. I took my time, paid attention to how I felt around people, rather than how I thought I should feel. I noticed the difference between nerves and discomfort, between excitement and anxiety. The man I see now isn't a grand love story or a dramatic whirlwind. He's kind, consistent, and emotionally present. He listens. He never raises his voice or makes jokes at my expense. And most importantly, he never makes me feel like his affection is something I have to earn. If it ends someday, I know I'll be okay. That knowledge alone feels like freedom. Therapy became less about crisis management and more about growth. We talked about boundaries, about why I'd ignored certain warning signs early on, and how to recognize patterns without blaming myself for missing them before. I learned that trusting someone doesn't make you weak, and being deceived doesn't make you foolish. It makes you human. I learned to replace self-criticism with curiosity, to ask not what's wrong with me, but what do I need right now? Occasionally, memories still surfaced. Not the sharp, suffocating kind, but distant ones, like photographs you stumble across unexpectedly, a song we used to listen to, a street we drove down often. When that happened, I let the feeling pass without engaging it. I didn't spiral or analyze. I simply acknowledged it and moved on. The past no longer demanded my attention. My parents noticed the change long before I did. My mother mentioned one evening over dinner that my laugh sounded different, lighter. My father said I seemed more like myself than I had in years. Hearing that made something click. I hadn't just survived what happened. I had grown beyond it. There was one quiet moment that sealed it for me. I was walking home from work on an ordinary weekday, thinking about what to cook for dinner, when I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd replayed that restaurant scene in my head, not out of effort or avoidance, but because it simply hadn't come up. The memory no longer lived rent-free in my mind. It had lost its grip. I didn't feel triumphant about it. I felt calm. Calm in a way I hadn't known before. The kind of calm that comes from self-trust, from knowing you will protect yourself if you ever need to again. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that clarity often comes wrapped in pain. That humiliation I endured wasn't the end of my story. It was the moment the illusion shattered, forcing me to see the truth I'd been bending myself around for too long. Mark didn't destroy me. He revealed himself. And in doing so, he gave me the opportunity to choose myself. I no longer define my life by what I escaped from. But I don't forget it either. It's part of my history, a chapter that taught me resilience, discernment, and so I carry those lessons forward quietly, letting them guide my decisions rather than weigh me down. 2 years later, I can say this without hesitation. I am genuinely happy, not in a performative way, not in a fragile, temporary way, but in a grounded, sustainable way. My life is full. My home is peaceful. My relationships are healthy, and my sense of self is intact. Sometimes I imagine that version of myself sitting in that restaurant, heart-pounding, trying to understand how everything unraveled so suddenly. I wish I could sit beside her and tell her that this moment, as unbearable as it feels, is the turning point. That she will look back on it one day not with shame, but with gratitude. That she will rebuild, stronger and wiser, and create a life that feels like her own. Pour the soda, walk out, don't explain, don't apologize. Trust that the pain will pass, even if it doesn't feel like it ever will. Your future is waiting, and it's kinder than you can imagine.